When you go to some of the mega churches, and look, I want to be clear, there's lots of research shows that good things come out of mega churches. So I think the point in our episode is that it's weird that size matters so much.
Yeah.
And that's an American value, but that doesn't mean that being big is always bad. Welcome back to Jesus versus America. Jesus told us that we couldn't serve two masters, but we're always trying to follow Jesus and also follow the dictates of the American culture. I'm John, and I'm joined by my good friends Monique and Wisdom, and together we represent three generations who are trying to faithfully follow Jesus. A big part of the reason we do this podcast is to try to figure out ways to peel apart the influence of the American culture so that we might recover a version of Christianity that we really can give our lives to. And so in this series, we're going to be looking at different values in the American culture and how they find their way into the church. And one of the values that we see almost everywhere that just seems to be a real big American value is size.
Yep.
Having everything be large and big and even larger than life.
Mm-hmm. Super size.
Yep.
Large and in charge, baby. Large and in charge.
That is an American value. So we're going to be looking at how that translates into the way we express our faith, the way we actually will, organize churches and organize our efforts. But before we get there, let's just talk about what some of those examples are. You guys have mentioned a couple, but where is it that Americans are obsessed with size everywhere? Where are some of these places? Like, I'll throw out a couple, like big houses.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Like we love big houses or big cities. Like we like big in almost everything.
Big houses, huge cars, the biggest car you can find, the gas guzzlers.
Big food. Like,
Big
have you
food.
been to the Cheesecake Factory recently?
Almost anywhere.
Where the chicken parm is as big as my head and the cheesecake's like this. And for value, for size too. So like McDonald's and all that stuff. Like
big bank accounts.
Yeah.
But that big food, big portions thing, like when other people come from other countries to visit us, they are just in shock.
Literally,
at how
big hair. The
everything
higher the
is,
hair, the closer to God.
The higher the hair, the bigger the hair, the bigger the secrets they're holding.
Yeah. Big box stores.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Or places that have endless selections. Like, it's not enough to have like 4 of something. You need to have like 40 of them, right?
Yeah.
Like, you need the biggest selection possible.
A
at the
huge
biggest
emergency
store.
shelter too. Stock it all up.
Yeah. Like, you want a huge furniture store that's like 5 blocks, that you're walking around because you don't just want one or 2 couches.
Hey man, but the food is so good.
Okay. There's that. We're obsessed with franchises, I wrote down.
Yeah.
Like we love anything where you see one of them, but then you see like 1,000 of them across the country. You go, that must be good because there's so many of them, right?
Yes.
Like, that's our value. Like, nobody will do something unless you look around.
Or like your area sucks if you don't have these franchises there. Like, if there is no Starbucks, there is no whatever. Like, you're in the boonies. Like, you're in the middle of nowhere because there's no franchise.
Hey, the bigger the diamond.
Oh, there you go.
That's true, right? Comparing rocks. So, ladies, we also have measuring contests.
that might be universal. Maybe that crosses other countries too. I don't know. That one might just be a universal trait. You mentioned those like franchises. I asked a friend of ours who's moving to Chicago, I'm like, do they have a Trader Joe's there? And he was offended that I even asked him. And I said, look, there's states that don't have them, so I'm just asking politely, like, do they have them so that you can keep doing what you do?
Like, more in terms of like activities. I feel like that, like, staying busy, like being insanely busy, I think is a very American value. So I'll have students, that are like 5 years old that are in swimming and cello, piano, dance, art, language, and school, and like more is more. Like, it's not enough to be even good at one thing. It's like, even in terms of
But we measure everything by these things, right? Like, if you go to a concert, like, we know our concert venues are big. They're big all over the world, but like, you have to know how many people are there so that you know like what the size of the crowd is. Like the band's going to play any differently, you know?
And you got to sell out. You got to sell out.
You got to know that there's like a huge venue. Or I think it's also values. Like, I was thinking about like the number of online reviews, the number of followers, the number of anything.
Number of likes on something. Yeah. I will not eat somewhere, actually, and if there is not a certain amount of so if it says 5 stars on Yelp, I have to know it wasn't 2 people that gave it 5 stars. It has to be a certain amount of people that gave it 5 stars, and how many reviews are there, even if it is good by the 2 people that have gone there. It's not enough for me.
Like, so I'm going to say this word, and it reminds me of big Amazon. So Amazon's huge, but I have the same reaction on Amazon. Like when I'm on Amazon and it says like, it has this many reviews, I look at it and go, that's not enough. Right. Like, so I find that I'm not even reading any reviews. I'm not even reading the descriptions. I'm just looking like, oh, that one has 5,000 reviews of like 3.9 or whatever. And this one only has 38, but they're like all 4 or 5 star reviews.
And it's like, I won't be the first to hop on the train. I want to follow where everyone else is going on this product.
That is a huge American value. That idea of like, I'll go to a movie when I hear it's at the top of the box office.
Or turnout, just judging success by turnout too. How many people came to my party? How many people came to an event? How many people showed up?
Like, big universities? Would that be one? Because
could be.
Is that an American thing? Like the university culture that's massive and like the hoorah?
As big as the ones we have. Like when you get to like 40,000 and 50,000 people at a single university. I mean, that is, that's a big value.
That is an American thing, right?
I think it is. I mean,
shout
we
out
like
to
everything.
My huge university.
Yeah, we like everything to be big. Or the way we advertise things to people where we go, millions of people can't be wrong. Like, because you go, oh, well, if millions of people agree on something, it must be good.
Yeah, big numbers, basically. Like, I think it's like big numbers.
It creates like this affirmation of our own choices. Like we want our choices to be affirmed. Yeah. Like, oh, I am going to a good concert or a good movie, or I'm reading a good book. It's on the New York Times bestseller list, right? And all these, and you read the back, it says, millions in print, and you go, oh, it must be good, right?
Why is every book a New York Times bestseller? Can we talk about that for a second?
We might talk about that like
on a different, how you can pay for
there
those
was a big Christian scandal where they paid to get on the New York Times.
Really?
Yeah. A number of years ago, there were a number of authors who actually would just have their publisher or their church go out and buy thousands of copies in the same week to get on the New York Times bestseller list, and then call themselves a New York Times bestselling author.
That happened with a particular movie too that I will not name because I don't want to give it more publicity, but that happened with a particular Christian movie as well. And churches were using their funds to buy out movie theaters to make it like a top movie and like begging people to take their tickets. It was really bad.
But that only works. And the reason we're so first of all, that's terrible. Right? Let's just be clear. Like if you're faking it to get onto a list or to make your pastor look like a celebrity or to make a movie, make waves in the culture, that's bad. But the only reason it works is because Americans in general are so obsessed with the metrics and the size. And if you go,
the numbers matter. It says something to us, which is, I mean, it's so cliche, right? When you say like, oh, quality over quantity. And you hear that all the time. But the reality of American culture is that we have said that if there is a huge quantity, we are superimposing on that it must mean it's quality.
Yeah, well, the place where quantity and quality don't meet is usually the buffet, by the way. That's the place where it doesn't meet. But it's interesting because as I've been thinking about this question this week, I realized that, look, I'm here to kind of critique this idea, and yet it's so in me. Yeah. Like, I realize, like, when I go to listen to a new band on Spotify, the first thing I do is look at, oh, my God, look how many views there are, how many listens they have, how many streams they have.
I don't know,
and I listen to those songs first because I think everyone else must have thought this is a really good song.
And they have it right under the song title,
they tell you, and it's not likes or follows. It's just like how many people have listened to the song, and I go, look, that song must not be
or like
good.
The artist name and then 1.5 million monthly listeners.
the biggest songs are always highlighted too, right?
Yeah, because they know, like, that's, so I think it's in us everywhere, whether it's song listens or the box office or all of these things, or reviews or follows or likes, or, like people in some circles, they measure themselves by, how many followers do you have? Yeah. And so if that's the American value, then I think what we're trying to do in this podcast in general, across all of our podcasts, is figure out a way to like say, okay, if we're going to peel apart the American culture from what following Jesus should be and is taught in Scripture, where are we blind as Americans to the fact that we have let all these things infect or get entangled with our churches?
How is the American idol of size seeped into church?
Yeah. So anyone want to... There's some obvious ones that we're like, we can just know right away. Like, I think we're all thinking the same thing. And then we didn't prep this. Like, where do you want to go? Like,
I mean, the mega church is always, I mean, You have to. That's like
how big. I'm just curious. How big are the mega churches? How big can they get on average? Do you know that number?
I went to one.
What's the minimum?
Okay, the minimum is 2,000. So if you're 2,000,
if
you're 2,000 and above, that's still the
metric.
Years ago, there were just a few that were above 2,000, right? But I don't know how big you can get. Like I visited one. I had 2 students that were working on staff at this mega church, and it has 27,000 people. Wow. And I went there out of curiosity or almost shock, I think, when I realized how big it was. And they said, would you like a tour? And I said, okay, I'd like to see what it'd be like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, they have trams bringing people from the parking lots like at Disneyland because the parking is so far away to have that many people on campus.
Crazy.
They have like 5 or 6 worship venues on the same campus, so you could kind of choose what type of worship music you want.
At the same time, operating at the same time.
Yeah, because you can go to this one, you can go to this one. The worship
Disneyland.
is different here.
It's like Coachella, like tent 1.
Yep, it is exactly like that. They might all watch the same message that's like broadcast from the main center. And they said, do you want to stand on the stage of the main center? And I was like, oh, okay. I mean, it was like a Tuesday. There was nobody there. So we walked up there and I'm just standing there and I was thinking like, I can't fit this into my head. I don't have a category for this. Like, I just don't even know what to do with this.
Like who are you connecting with? And I mean, something that's closely tied to that. I mean, we can talk about more practical reasons why size hurts the church in terms of mega church for like, knowing who your congregants are, how they're connecting. There's doing an open-ended forum. People get to ask questions. I'm sure we're going to talk about that. You can't do that in a large setting. There's all these practical things we can get into. But just really briefly, I want to talk about something that also touches upon that, which maybe this will be another one of our American Idol series, is the cult of fandom and like the cult of personality
and celebrity.
And celebrity, right? All those things, however you want to label it. So
the bigness of the pastor, the bigness of the personality.
That does kind of lead to a weird, like, I don't want to say outright worship of like the leader, but it is a weird fandom and something that didn't sit right with me that I'm sure has happened with many other churches is, I went to a church once. I visited, and it was like a second location. And a friend of mine was working there. I was very involved in this church, and we're like, oh yeah, we have a second campus. I'm like, oh, like how does that work? Like you have a different pastor. It's like, no, people just sit in seats and watch a screen of the pastor speaking at the main campus. Mm-hmm. That is,
they're called satellite campuses, right?
It is just. Think about how weird that is. Like you just want, or the church agrees that it is better for more people to listen to you than to just set up another church with another pastor in a different location
to tend to the flock of the people in that
are there. So it's not really about like injecting something into this community. It's about more people getting to see you and hear you as a main pastor and get the experience of
Joel
that
Osteen's
person.
church in Texas, like wasn't it a football field that they bought?
I think it's a basketball stadium or something
basketball
like that.
Stadium something like that they converted into the sanctuary. Yeah. And so when you see him preach, it literally is a stadium for sports.
It might be football because it's big. It's huge.
I think it's football. I'm pretty sure it's football because that thing looks too small to be basketball.
I mean, that might excite some people, which is why we got to get into all the logistics.
But it's more than exciting people. I think that since we were talking about our values of like we need to be validated in our decisions by the number of people who either agree or rate and review or whatever it is.
Right.
When you go to some of the mega churches, and look, I want to be clear. There's lots of research shows that good things come out of mega churches. So I think the point in our episode is that it's weird that size matters so much. Yeah. And that's an American value, but that doesn't mean that being big is always bad. Well, any more than being small is always bad.
Right.
But it is interesting that the same value of like, I look around and there's 20,000 other people who agree that this is a good place.
Right. Yep. The spirit is moving. Yep. And
what are the good things that you said that the research has found in mega churches?
So the things that aren't found, for example, are like the connection to a pastor who's pastoring or some of those things. It also does something to your soul when you're sitting in a stadium, like it almost puts you in a passive place, right? You're not. So those are some of the things that might be, those things shape our souls. Mm-hmm. But there are they have resources to do amazing things.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They also reportedly have a higher level of baptisms, a higher level.
Sure.
So there are things that you go, wow. And I don't mean just
because every Sunday's a revival.
Yeah. Well, it's not like, well, they have 500 because that church had 5. It's as a percentage of people coming to the church.
It's a higher.
Okay.
And so it attracts a certain kind of person too, who may not be, I'm going to say,
like maybe it's good for what we call like the baby Christian or the new Christian. Like maybe it's enough to sustain you for that. And that's the positive, but.
And some megachurches really do well with like the small groups, like they have hundreds of them. So there is a smaller expression. But, like we're not here to say what's better, big or small. Like, of course, you can find like small churches don't have resources, but everyone knows everybody.
Sure.
Those kind of things, right? So there's all sorts of stuff. Small churches might be ruled by a mob from the congregation, whereas that can't happen at a big church because they run like a corporation. Right. There's a board.
But,
you can't do that.
But bigger doesn't automatically mean better. And I think that's the point. And I won't name this church, I guess, but there was a church kind of in the Pacific Northwest up that was quite large, and for me it's like the higher you go the harder you fall, right? So you might go to this and it had a lot of like energy and momentum behind it, and it was huge, and you just think, oh, the Spirit must be blessing this and moving it because it's just multiplying. And then all these things, like the theology was bad, all of these scandals came out, like really hardcore stuff, and it fell apart. And the damage that does to someone, in their faith can be quite astronomical. So bigger, it doesn't mean you're automatically bad, but we can't equate like, oh, well, the Spirit must be moving because it's growing, so this must be a great place. Like, not always. Yeah.
I think when there is a church scandal, a large church, and people just leave, that's understandable. That's heartbreaking. But I always wonder,
where do they go?
Is it because first it was a cult of personality, so you weren't really at that church, you were at that person's church, right? So that's the first thing. And the second one is, I
knew someone who wanted to move to attend the church I'm speaking of, by the way, because they just wanted to be a part of that.
Right. But that's the second part, is the reason so many people leave is because now they're not at the church anymore. And they're feeling bad about their own choices, right? So I understand that a leadership failure is really traumatic, but
at any size.
But I think it's exacerbated by the fact that we're disappointed now that we're not at a church that everybody can validate and make me feel good about my choices. And that goes back to our thing with size. We talked about like different like places you might watch it on a screen or just the multi-site church. It turns out that like only 1 out of 10 multi-site churches use video exclusively and people watch it. But it just kind of reminded me again of that American value. Like multi-site is just another word for franchise.
Yes.
Like I have a brand. We're a cool brand. People know my brand, whether it's like Hillsong
let's give it
or
to
whatever.
Them in every town.
And then
it's the
everybody
Starbucks of churches.
Or it's like the Cheesecake Factory, or it's like everybody knows a place. Oh, I know the Lazy Dog Cafe. Let's have them everywhere. And then everybody will just go like lemmings, right? And forget all the good places. You know, before you get there, you know what you're going to order and it's going to taste the same, right? Well, but that's what's happening in the multi-site movement is you are spreading out because they're saying, look, we got a brand, we know it, we got a formula.
And on
spread
top of that, if those multi-site, the extension of that church doesn't do well according to your standards, they take like a franchise, they take it out of the area.
You don't have any autonomy. You got to follow the formula.
Because there's a level of success for that franchise that they're used to hitting, and if they don't,
I went to such a church, and I liked it. Was I don't know how big that church really was, but they had a few. 3 or 4 in different cities. And I really liked mine, and it was super small, and we all knew each other, but we were super small. So they nixed us from the,
I remember visiting you there. That's right. I do remember that, you know? Right.
From the budget. They're like, you're killing our budget.
And that's like a franchise. Like if the Starbucks isn't doing well in the middle of nowhere, they take the Starbucks out.
So and they were making enough over here to continue to float it, but they just didn't want to.
Yeah. Because they're just obviously not enough people to be counted successful. So to his side. Yeah. Here's some stats. So 70% of churches have 100 or fewer weekly worship attenders. So like 70% of churches have 100 or less in weekly attendance. So that means that the majority of churches are on the smaller side of the scale. Yeah. Only 10% of churches have 250 or more weekly attenders. So we're really talking, when we start getting the size level, we really are talking an increasingly small thing. But here's what was interesting to me. 70% of churchgoers attend a church with 250 or more people. So 70%
Are
of the people
looking
going
for
to church
bigger-
go to 10% of the churches, right? And I think this is what's going to continue because
that's so interesting.
if our
isn't it?
American value of size is what matters, and I'm not talking about the church because they can't grow themselves. You have to go and vote with your feet to grow them.
Oh, and also more programs. That just came to me. Because if they're bigger, there's more programs and things for kids and youth and cool things to do. More is more is more is more.
That church I visited had I still can't get over it. Like it had a 4 or 5 story kids ministry building with like 4 or 5 huge rooms for the same grade on every floor.
Which would be great for a community center.
And they had video game like stations in the atrium overlooking like they had like animals like iguanas and all that. I mean, I just couldn't get it into my head.
We're gonna talk after because I think I know which one it is, but I don't. Yeah.
And then the junior high and high school building. It was an entire building, and you know how Christians are the only ones that play foosball. They had like 20 foosball tables.
I can't with you, John.
20 foosball tables, and then the junior high or high school, depending on the night, where they did the worship it fit 1,200 people just for the junior high. Wow. And I just thought, like, my mind doesn't
even the kids are getting the mega.
Yeah,
this is shaping their minds, their
like your
attitudes.
church is supposed to look like a Chuck E. Cheese. For it to.
Oh, they had the ball thing, where you jump in the balls.
Yeah,
and like they had that in the classrooms. They had it in the classrooms.
Okay, but low key, that would have been my dream.
I know it would have been my dream.
So that's how we get people to follow Jesus. You need a ball pit, and if you don't have a ball pit at your church, that's the reason you're losing the youth.
Like it's not that. Man.
Paul would be writing a letter
here's
so
where
fast.
I'm torn, and this is where maybe we invest in community centers that actually benefit everybody as Christians, right? But it's like the idea to have these facilities, hopefully for use of any kid. Like you could make it that way. It's like you can see how that would be like a positive thing, but the other side of me is like, I just want to strip faith down. I want to strip it down and make sure you're walking in for one reason and one reason only. Like we're together and we're worshiping God, and let's talk about hard things and let's speak about scripture. And can that happen at a mega church? I mean, I guess, but you shouldn't need all the bells and whistles is what I'm saying. It's like the overstimulated generation. We worry about them, right? Because they're just like on all the apps and constantly, it's like you're turning your faith
That's a great episode idea of like youth ministry and like how the people coming out of youth ministry are doing into like how they're formed in their faith as young adults and beyond.
Because you needed
with this
so
kind
many
of
bells
tactic.
and whistles.
Like, what you attract them with is
what you and you lose them because you attracted them with something that they soon. But I want to be clear that I don't think this is so much about what's wrong with the mega church. It's what's wrong with us because
we're filling
that
up these seats.
church could not grow or support those
without
programs
the mentality.
without our idol of size supporting it. Like when we go, oh, they have trams from the parking lot, they must be really good, right? And they didn't say anything. We did. We were like, oh my God, they have a tram. Like I have to go there. Like they have a venue just for country music worship. Okay, never mind that one. The other things like those are the things that I think that's what we're trying to peel apart on this podcast is like, why is size so embedded in us? Well, it's because it's from the American culture.
Yeah. We're consuming our faith.
Yep, and you're going to a stadium-like place. What brand of it do you want?
Yeah. What genre?
Yep. So I think that we have to look inward on some of these things because this idol is given to us from a young age in the American culture, and it's no wonder that megachurches are growing because we ourselves are adhering to this. And I think when you think about like those smaller churches, the number of smaller churches keeps growing, because there'll be like more and more percentage that are below 100. And one of the reasons is because these large churches are almost like vacuuming up the people, right? And we're doing
that
it.
Interesting.
But
also,
we're the ones that are going because we're like, oh, it must be good. Look down the street to have that big thing. Like there must be doing something right.
It's kind of like when you were talking about Christian universities in our other episode. You're like forcing them to attend chapel so many times at this campus. Is pulling them out of the churches that these college kids could be directly involved in, like in a natural, organic, community-based church.
Yeah.
It's like a very similar
It is really
pulling.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what we need to do in an episode like this, because there have been people who've written great things about the megachurch, the good things, the difficult things. One of the guys who speaks on this all the time is a guy named Ed Stetzer. He's a missiologist. He's a well-known person in the church. He's recently become the dean of a school of theology. He himself has led a megachurch. But the reason I think of him is every year Outreach Magazine puts out the Outreach 100, which is the 100 biggest churches in America. They have a list, and he's the one that writes the whole thing saying, look, we're not saying megachurches are better. We're not saying they're better. We're not saying, he does this every year, he has to say this. Our whole magazine is about all churches, but once a year we do a list of the 100 biggest, which I by myself still think we shouldn't even have that, right?
Yeah.
Like we should just how about 100 most impactful churches regardless of size?
Yes.
People who've done the 100
Billboard
most
Hot
creative
100
things. Yeah.
or
It's so strange.
Forbes 30 under 30.
But just like the 100 coolest ideas we've heard in Christianity, right? Like no matter what size your church is, but
So
whatever.
strange.
He is also somebody who speaks. He speaks in favor of small churches, so he tries to be balanced. But one of the things that's interesting, I saw this thing that he was writing about, and somebody was writing about him. He said, I went to a conference, this is the pastor who's writing this. I went to a conference, Ed Stetzer was there, and there were 10 speakers at this big, huge conference for pastors. And out of the 10 speakers, only Ed was not pastoring a church that was 10,000 people or more. So imagine who's sitting in the audience, a bunch of small church pastors, and the whole conference is this is how you grow your church. This is how you grow your church. This is how you grow your church. This is how we did it. I'm like, you didn't do anything. God did that. Let's get that straight, right?
Right.
Let's just keep
that right there.
Let's keep that in perspective. Like if God didn't want that to happen, it would never happen, right? And regardless of your celebrity and all your stuff and your merch and your coffee and your watches and your whatever. Okay.
And your sneakers and your books
all that.
and your CDs
whatever.
and your albums.
Okay, but Ed said this. He looked out at all the small church pastors, and I think he had a moment of compassion for them, because I really do think he loves churches of all sizes. He said to the people sitting there, he said, look, what is being presented is like ministry pornography. This is what's being presented. It is an unrealistic depiction of an experience that you are never going to have, and it distracts you from the real and glorious thing you're supposed to do.
He said this at the conference.
After
all those guys.
Like, of course, in the midst of all this is, he's just saying this is a distorted way of understanding the church.
Why put it up there?
But that's the thing, because people will go to it. And again, who's going to it? Remember, they could have put on a conference of a bunch of people that led churches of 10,000 or more.
People at big churches or people that want them, both.
Yeah.
They're like, we want what you have.
Exactly. And if it wasn't for the idol of size that is in the heart of every one of us, me included, and every small church pastor that showed up to this conference hoping to learn how to grow bigger, I think that it would just kind of on its own, people are like, wait a minute, we need to repent of this. This is an idol. And we can see that it's indoctrinated from the American culture. That's fine. That's a culture. That's American culture. Let us have big box stores and let us have all these things.
Right.
That's great. Let us have big portions. That's American. Just should it be Christian?
Right.
Should it be the way of Jesus? And we are
The
unthinkingly just importing all of that into the church.
Yeah. And I had a friend once tell me about a church I was going to compared to a church she was going to. And she was like, I know I hear people in your church saying all the time, it's only, 3 years old, so that's why it's small. She goes, in 3 years, we did this amount of numbers. That's not an excuse. So clearly something's wrong there. The Spirit's not moving. And if you're not growing, something's wrong with your church. And I'm like, that is a weird assumption. And she's no longer at that church, which I visited several times, and there was some weird stuff going on there. And I remember sitting back and kind of being like, the numbers and the growing, this is not the indication.
Right. But it's in our heart. You met Francis Chan, right? And he has a pretty famous quote
we mentioned the name.
He said this is one of the reasons that led him away from the mega church he led.
Yeah.
He came home to his wife one day and he said, if I had a church where I have it now, and if Jesus had a church in the same town, my church would be bigger.
Yeah.
Right? So she's looking at him like, oh man, you're going to get struck down right now.
Yeah.
Right? But what he was really saying is Jesus
himself could have a small group of 12 people sitting down on the corner.
And all the crowds that followed him,
Yeah.
the moment he said hard things, fled.
And he's a founder
please repeat that, because that struck that sentence. The moment
that Jesus said hard and difficult things, the crowds left, to the point that he had to turn to his own disciples and say, are you going to leave me too? Mm-hmm. And they responded and said, to whom shall we go? Like, you have the very words of eternal life, right?
Yeah.
But the crowds fled. He
Right.
thinned them out every time by saying something
fun,
difficult.
and what's easier and what has less eyes on me and what can I get away with more and what feels good and
Right.
like it's just
And
drawing.
that's why France is like, I don't think I can keep doing this because what must I be doing that Jesus didn't do?
Yeah.
Or what, like, what am I not doing that Jesus did that causes my church to keep growing?
It
Because
actually pushed
like,
him to leave. So when I had met him, he was in the process of moving to a different country. And I had asked him, like, oh, why are you doing that? You have this successful church and like organization here. It was in Southern California.
Again, an American thing. You're like, it's full
It actually
of
pushed him
success.
towards a kind of a
Best-selling books.
missional mindset where him and his entire family, his daughters and their husbands, all together as a family unit, decided to move to a different country. And he had said, he's like, because doing ministry in this area where I was is like fishing at a tiny, tiny pond when there's a whole lake out there. And I don't want to be in the pond kind of budging shoulders
Fishing
with
in a
everyone
stocked-
else
in a
in the
stocked
same
pond.
kind of place. And by the way, every fish in the pond is fished for in that area too, right? Like who are filling these churches are it's reaching the reached,
we're
right?
reaching the reach. We're
Reaching
just
the
like a
reached.
vacuum cleaner sucking up the transfer growth from other smaller churches because they.
Yeah.
But again, it's they. That's the thing I want us to be looking at, like inwardly as we think about idols.
It's the people making the choice to
We're the
to
ones that are
attend.
walking across the street to go to the bigger church because the idol is in us. The church just isn't going to blow up just because it's run by all these celebrities. We have to worship celebrity. We have to worship size. We have to worship those idols in order for it to work. And that's great if it works in the American culture. It shouldn't be the value we use in the church. And again, it's not the church people, it's us. Like, I mean, we're church people, but I'm not saying it's not the leaders of the church alone. It's the congregants, it's the visitors, it's all of us. There's another resource we want to recommend. This is Carl Vader's book, De-Sizing the Church. I followed Carl for a lot of years. He's a small church pastor. He writes regularly to encourage small church pastors. He's the one that always says, like, anytime I go to any pastor conference, when they come up to you, the first thing they ask you is like, so how many people do you run on a Sunday? Like, it's almost the way we judge each other when we go, what do you do? What's your, like, that's all we care about. Like, hey, how are you doing? So what do you do for a living? In pastor world, he says basically it's they look at you and they say, so how many do you run on a Sunday? And then the
answer carries weight, right?
It does, because he says people will walk away, just turn around uninterested when I say, oh, we have like 110 people or 150 people,
Instead of
whatever
being
his
like,
number is.
wow, what's that like?
Nothing. They're like, oh, okay, well, thanks. Good meeting you. And just I'm going to go look for somebody who's got a better church or a bigger church. Same thing, by the way.
Yeah.
So I can actually talk to somebody that is interesting. And so he's done this for 40 years, faithfully served in the small church. He's written about it. He's blogged about it. He's a podcast about it. In de-sizing the church, he's basically saying, look, I'm not saying big is bad. I'm not saying small is bad. I'm just saying we should have to stop focusing on size, right?
Yes.
Because it does something to us. So here's one of the quotes in this introduction. He says, the idea of a church constantly getting bigger began as an outlier. Then it became a goal. Now it's the standard by which the performance of all churches are measured. Our obsession with numerical success is overwhelming pastors. It's stifling churches and it's ruining our witness. Yeah. Size comes at a price. And that's where it stopped me. Like, that's why he wants to get the emphasis off, because
cost you
size
some things.
comes at a price. There's a price to get it, a price to maintain it, and a huge price when it doesn't work out the way you expected.
Well, and I mean,
That's
and it's
so good, that latter
It's
part.
almost like the same idea of living beyond your means as well, right? Like if you grow to a certain number and you buy that $2 million building, now it's more important to keep those numbers because someone's going to come take that building away. You're going to default on that mortgage, or like you're paying for more. You have to care about the size. Now the driving factor is we got to keep people paying. We can't tick them off too much with the message. So it's affecting that because we got to keep them in the seats because we need the tithing because we have to pay for all of the things that we chose to expand into. Did we need a satellite location? Probably not, but we did it. So now we got to pay for it.
Yeah, because all of us have bought into the idea that more and more and more is blessing, more and more and more is kingdom work, and more and more. But, the last thing I'll comment on this is when I visited that church, one of the things I saw when I was standing on that stage, just imagining what it'd be like to talk to that many people. I'd have to blur them all out. I wouldn't see them anyway, just how would you even focus on a single person? We walked out the back. So here's the stage facing the whole stadium thing. And we walked out the back of this thing and he's like, this is the place where they drive the car up on Sunday morning with the bodyguards so he can come backstage, jump up and speak.
Bodyguards?
They had bodyguards. And then
Who's
afterwards.
coming for this man?
Like, well, you never know. You might say something about, Black Lives Matter or something. Who knows,
I've
right?
seen this over and over again, though, where
Yeah.
the pastor's like a celebrity and has
and then they leave
special
and they
treatment.
go somewhere else. Like they're like maybe they'll go out and like greet people afterwards, but that old thing where
I had to close my jaw there.
in
for
the
a
old days when the
second.
pastor walked down the aisle and like greeted every person when they're walking out of the church,
Yeah.
like that is some
I grew up-
bygone era.
I grew up in a church like that.
Me too.
Yeah, well, they didn't have a place where the bodyguards like had the car waiting for you right after the message, so you can go run off and
But
do
like
that.
also like no matter what a huge church can do, because we're not saying there aren't benefits, right? Imagine the optics of that though to non-Christians.
Or to Christians, it's telling
Or to
them.
Christians.
It's telling them like this person. I mean, like look, all these things they form us, right? You sit
Yeah.
in a stadium-looking church. You feel
Yeah.
like an audience member. Why? Because you know what you do in a stadium. You cheer or you sit
cheer,
back.
you
You're not.
root,
You don't.
you-
Yeah. You watch.
Yeah,
Right.
you're definitely
Yeah.
like it's almost voyeuristic. Like you're
Yep.
just there to like
Mm-hmm.
And then
look at it
because you
happen.
can't have access to your pastor at all times, you kind of name drop when you do. It's like, I actually
Yeah.
interned for him
Yeah.
this one
Yeah.
summer, and I got to hang out with his wife. And you're name dropping like as if they're like,
My student was the third chief of staff to this guy. There was the first chief of staff, the second chief of staff, and his head was this big that he was the third chief of staff. And I'm like,
yeah.
oh man, like someday you're going to
it's
feel
a little
goofy for
look, it's
being so proud
a
of
little
that.
bit culty.
Yeah.
It's a little bit culty. And I just feel like if someone is watching who like if you're part of a mega church and you love it, I don't think it's like we're condemning like there's something wrong with your faith, but there is value in asking yourself the question like, what drew you there? Why are you there? Has the idea of size like subconsciously infiltrated like how you're choosing churches? Are you growing? Have you grown? Is it just fun? Do you just participate in like all the things that are the resources that are available to you, or do you have spiritual growth? Are you dealing with hard things? Are you
And are you good with the anonymity? Like that's why you're there. You don't want to be
interesting?
like you don't
Yes.
want like there's.
Do you
it's-
like that you
yeah.
don't have to really get involved, because in a small church you got to. It's like all hands on deck, right?
Yeah.
But
People know you. There's accountability, right? All that.
accountability, like just all of the. It's a good question to
Yeah.
ask.
But I'm going to go the other way because I want to be fair about, we're trying to say we need to de-size, not just to critique the large size. In a small church, we need to ask the same questions like, wait a minute, is the
Yeah.
reason we've never had a baptism here in the last 5 years because
Yeah.
we really are not preaching the gospel and we are just so
Right.
inwardly focused?
Yep.
Even if we're 400 people, but we've not had a baptism.
The
maybe
inwardly focused. That's good too, because
we
that's
need
a
to know
huge
that,
thing
right? So
with
maybe
the
we're kind
small-
of feeling smug like, oh, we're not that big. We do
I
great
grew up in a
things
church
here.
that was
Insulated.
300 people in the 12 years that I'd been there. And, they were like, we're not, mega church this. But in the small church, there's problems there of
Yeah.
like, it's the same 300
Yeah.
people and it's only growing because
Insulated
you guys are
and
marrying each other
incestuous.
and having babies. Yeah.
Insulated and incestuous.
Yep. So
yeah.
there's those things like, so while you could say like, hey, you're at a mega church because you don't want to be seen or you don't want to give, there's lots of people at mega churches that are
Yeah.
giving and they're volunteering like crazy and they're doing amazing ministries that
Right.
can only be done through that church. The question is the one you ask, like, what value is going on
Right.
here? Where did I get this?
Yes.
Is this an idol? Is this a thing? And same at the smaller church. Am I comfortable in the small place? Am I inwardly focused?
Listen, I've known a couple of those too, real small churches that weren't growing and they were too comfortable and it was stagnant.
If you go for several years and there isn't a baptism other than the kids that are
Yep,
born at that
yep,
church,
yep.
Ask
there's
yourself
something
That's
wrong.
literally it.
Right,
Yep.
right.
That's the
right.
test. Like you want to live in this test of like, am I at like a healthy church? Like one of the first ones I ask is like, when was the last baptism and how old were they? And if they're 12 and under, they don't
Yeah.
count. In fact,
Right.
it should be even higher. Like when was the last time somebody
But
who
then the
didn't
big
grow up in that
churches are
church
like,
got
well, we
baptized?
had 50 just like.
Yeah, I know. And
It's like a drive-through. Like, we just baptize people.
and who knows what that represents too, again. But the main point is, I think, for us to ask ourselves, is this an idol that I've imported into my views of the church
Right.
from the American culture?
Yeah.
Because it is an American cultural
It is.
thing.
Yeah.
It is
we
an idol.
care about size.
Yep,
Yeah.
it's an American idol. Yep, and that's the reason we keep perennially asking, does size matter? In almost every magazine that you guys can answer that in a bonus episode. It's like
After
size
dark.
matter, right? Yeah, we'll put that behind a paywall if you guys want to hear that. That's our view on size. We just want, our ultimate goal is to say, we see it. It's an American value, good for America. Should it be in the church? Should it be in us? We need to repent of this if it's an idol in any way or in our lives.
Yeah.
And it is shaping our churches. So that's something we want to hear from you about this. Tell us what you think, or you can even recommend another idol that we can do. We've got several coming up, but we'd love to hear what you think. This is Jesus versus America.
Follow us on all social media platforms at Jesus versus America, and find more resources on our official website, jesusversusamerica.com.